Hi everyone, my name is Abby Power. I just want to talk to you a little bit about myself, why I'm here, and what I hope to achieve with this presentation. I am currently pursuing a Master's of Arts in Humane Education, and as a humane educator, I'm exploring the connections between human rights, environmental ethics, and animal protection so that we can begin to make systematic change. This solutions-oriented approach is key as we work toward creating a more just and humane world. I'm also an animal rights activist, and I share a deep passion to advocate for the end of the unnecessary suffering of animals around the world. My intention is to talk about the injustice and global challenges that we face as humans and what we need to know in order to best advocate for human rights and animal protection. Once we start to uncover the invisible and sometimes visible connected systems of injustice, the barriers can begin to crumble. This presentation is certainly not meant to be an exhaustive look at the connections, but a sample that will help us understand these issues better to make us better advocates. I want to first talk about slave labor, child trafficking, and marginalized communities. Our food system is filled with both human and animal exploitation. Ghana and the Ivory Coast in West Africa provide 60% of the world's cocoa. Several thousands of young children, some reported as young as 5 years old, go missing every year where they're forced to work on cocoa plantations. They're given machetes to harvest the cocoa pods and carry large sacks on their backs all day long. Children sustain many injuries and are often beaten if they're not able to keep up. They live in horrific spaces and do not have access to adequate meals. And just to point out, Hershey's, Mars, and Nestle are just a sample of the companies that source their cocoa from this part of Africa. According to Kevin Bales, president of Free the Slaves, there are 27 million slaves in the world today, and at least 10,000 of them live in the United States. They've been brought here from all different countries because they're poor and they're desperate for work. So why don't they just quit and look for work elsewhere? Well, many can't just leave their job for a number of different reasons. Perhaps they can't speak English, they have no money to escape because they've given all of their money to the traffickers in hopes for a better future. They're terrified of the police, they're worried that they'll be attacked if they try to leave, and many don't even know how to get help in the first place. This is really an economic crime. People enslave people in order to make a profit. The same thing can be said for animals. People enslave animals in order to make a profit. In order for the crops to remain competitive on the market, they have to keep production and labor costs down, and they do that through trafficking and slave labor, unfair wages and work conditions. This happens in so many different industries, from coffee to cocoa to bananas. But we also see this exploitation in the animal agriculture industry. There have been reports of forced labor and other human rights abuses within the Thai fishing sector. Vulnerable migrant workers are put in abusive situations with no escape. And in 2012, there was a study done, and it was found that almost 1 in 5 working in the Thai fishing sector reported working against their will, with the menace of a penalty preventing them from leaving. Now, moving on to the United States, in 2009, Ohio Fresh Eggs was found exploiting underage immigrant children as slave labor. Again, parallels to what we see with the children working on the cocoa plantations. Now, when we talk about slaughterhouses, I think it's important to point out that people that work in the slaughterhouses don't do it because they want to, but they do it because they have to. The psychological torture alone makes slaughterhouse workers susceptible to perpetration-induced stress disorder, and it's linked to anger, violence, and domestic violence. The workers are predominantly people of color living in low-income communities. Many are undocumented or non-English speakers, and they face grave and dangerous occupational hazards, as well as sexual harassment. Because they're part of this marginalized part of society, many can't report these abuses for fear of retaliation or deportation. As Carol Adams and Ginny Messina point out in Protest Kitchen, there are many examples of this. In South Dakota, Puerto Rican hurricane survivors have resorted to working in turkey killing plants because they have no other option. In Oklahoma, a treatment program for drug offenders that keeps them out of prison actually acts as a labor camp for slaughterhouses for those large food companies. They receive no actual treatments, nor do they receive any wages. Instead, the money will go to the Christian Alcoholics and Addicts in Recovery program. But what about where these factory farms are located? Are there any human rights issues that we can find? And the answer is yes. We can't forget what happened this year in North Carolina during Hurricane Florence, and previously in 2016 during Hurricane Matthew, when the waste from the pig farms flooded and polluted the area, not to mention the thousands and thousands of pigs that drowned during the event. The environmental damage alone is something that I want to address. These huge open-air waste lagoons are prone to leaks and spills, which have killed millions of fish and closed hundreds of thousands of coastal wetlands. Nutrients and animal waste cause algae blooms, which use up all the oxygen in the water, which contribute to dead zones, like we see in the Gulf of Mexico, where there's just not enough oxygen to support aquatic life. These spills also contaminate the water supply, leading to devastating effects on the communities. But let's look again at the human component. Why is the location of these factory farms important? Because it tells a story. Factory farms are disproportionately located near low-income communities of color. These corporations lure these communities with the promise of increased tax revenue. However, what they're left with is falling property value, polluted water, crumbling infrastructure, and devastating health consequences. In 2005, the Iowa Policy Project found that the highest poverty areas in North Carolina had more than 7 times as many hog farms as affluent communities, and communities of color had 5 times as many hog farms as predominantly white areas. Those that live near these factory farms experience higher rates of mortality, both infant and adult, kidney disease, tuberculosis, birth defects, and asthma due to the high levels of noxious gases and waste. Next, I want to move on to the connection of the rights of Indigenous people, environmental destruction, and poverty. The amount of devastation that the animal agricultural industry has on the world is frightening. Every second, 1 to 2 acres of rainforest are cleared for grazing livestock or growing animal feed. Up to 137 plant, animal, and insect species are lost every day because of the destruction of these biodiverse regions of our planet. Specifically, within the Amazon rainforest, the home for at least 10% of the world's known biodiversity, 91% of deforestation is caused by livestock. The Amazon rainforest plays a key role in absorbing carbon and moderating climate. Not only is this a huge environmental concern, but it's also a concern for the indigenous people that live off this land. They're constantly threatened by ranchers and loggers ready to take over, further depleting their resources and homes. Tribes such as the Kayapo are forced to take action and are now fighting back. Anthropogenic climate change, or human-influenced climate change, is something that we're all facing. When we tear down the rainforest for animal agriculture, we are not only losing the trees that sequester carbon emissions, but we're also contributing to the rise in CO2 levels. Animal agriculture contributes more than 18% to overall greenhouse gas emissions, more than all of the transportation sector combined. Climate change isn't just a single issue. Like everything else, its reach is far and wide. Animal agriculture is incredibly resource intensive. Up to half of the world's harvest is fed to animals, while there are 800 million people that go hungry every day. Climate change is especially damaging to impoverished communities. In places like Bangladesh, Haiti, Puerto Rico, India, and Nepal, the effects of flooding, droughts, and climate events have been devastating. Because of the lack of infrastructure, whole communities have been wiped out, crops destroyed, and people's livelihoods have been decimated. One study found that the average yield of 8 major crops in Africa and South Asia are expected to decrease by 8% by the 2050s due to climate change. And remember, the human population is supposed to grow to 9.7 billion people by 2050. So we have less crops and more people. What could go wrong? These major economic losses have stopped any progress on health and education initiatives. And really, how is a community supposed to constantly rebuild itself when they have nothing? As Muhammad Yunus said in his book, Creating a World Without Poverty, Poverty doesn't only condemn humans to lives of difficulty and unhappiness, it can expose them to life-threatening dangers. As I mentioned earlier, natural disasters affect those areas most because they don't have the money to build infrastructure that will keep them safe. Another offshoot of how climate change affects human rights is that when resources are impacted and dwindle, it promotes local competition for land and water, which subsequently fuels social tensions, population displacement, and even violent conflict. We see this with Boko Haram around Lake Chad in northern Africa. The last area I want to focus on is food injustice because I think this is a challenge many of us face as animal rights activists. I think it's important to acknowledge that many of us come from a position of privilege. If we know where we're sleeping tonight and where our next meal is coming from, we're privileged. Understanding this will help us have more effective conversations with people from all different backgrounds. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, more than 41 million people live in food insecure households. This means that many times throughout the year, households are unable to provide enough food for all family members. They may not have enough money to buy food, or they may just lack the resources like transportation to purchase it. And for many of us, this is really hard to grasp what this actually feels like. When you live more than a mile from a grocery store, fresh food may be harder to obtain. Instead, there are corner stores that rarely have any fresh food or vegetables, and sometimes they're even called food swamps because although there's food available, the food is found in the form of health-poor fast food. And this inadequacy in nutrition can have lasting impacts on children's cognitive development, their immune system, brain development, height and weight growth, and even the ability for children to get along with their peers. As of January 2016, 45.4 million people were participating in the SNAP program, and out of that group, 44% of the SNAP participants were children. The average SNAP benefit per person is around $126 per month, which works out to be about $1.40 per person per meal. Not much at all. Emergency food shelters are no longer used just in emergencies, and this chronic use is a sign of a broken system. So the question remains, can the world go vegan? And I've really thought about this, and I don't know. If reduced or free school meals don't offer plant-based alternatives, or there's no vegan cost-appropriate options where you live, what are people supposed to do? There is so much work to be done. And if people living in areas of food injustice can't speak up for themselves with their food choices, we must do it for them until they're able to. We must then fight for their equality, because ultimately that means fighting for the animals. So let's step back and take a look. What is the common thread in all of these stories? It's the oppression of marginalized communities. This invisible system of injustice is exploitative, it creates economic disadvantage, higher rates of health issues, and even vulnerability to climate change. It is also the same system that upholds the oppression of animals. Inequality hinders compassion because it's harder to feel compassion when you see yourself as superior to someone else. So you see, human rights issues are animal rights issues. It's not an either-or situation. You don't have to decide which you want to advocate for because it's all connected. The key is ending injustice, period. That's when the system starts to crumble. And as Carol Adams and Jenny Messina say in Protest Kitchen, veganism is an act of resistance, and we need to resist injustice for all. Thank you all so very much for listening to this presentation. I hope you gained something out of it. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My website is www.abbypower.com, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.